The morning my Omega disappeared was the morning I discovered the palace had never truly been my home. Prince Alexander Whitmore had everything the world believed a man could desire. He was the future king of Whitmore Kingdom, the heir to a powerful royal family, and the person everyone expected to carry the crown with perfect confidence. Yet on the quiet morning after the royal ceremony, Alexander stood inside an empty room and felt a silence he had never known before. But before that silence existed, there was a night when everything changed. The Grand Hall of Whitmore Palace was filled with nobles, advisors, and members of the royal family. Crystal lights reflected across the marble floor as Ethan Brooks stood before the throne, waiting for the decision that would define their future. Ethan had never wanted the crown. He had never wanted the attention of the kingdom. He only wanted to know if Alexander would choose him as the person who would stand beside him. For years, Ethan believed that behind the cold expression of the prince was a man who cared deeply. He had seen Alexander's hidden worries, his quiet moments of uncertainty, and the pressure he carried as the future ruler. Ethan loved the person behind the title. But Alexander looked at the room, filled with expectations, and remembered every responsibility waiting for him. He had convinced himself that feelings could not guide a future king. He believed tradition mattered more than personal happiness. When Ethan finally asked the question he had been waiting years to ask, the entire hall became silent. "Do you choose me?" Alexander looked at him, and for a moment, his expression softened. But then the prince made the decision that would follow him for years. "You will never be my Omega." The words were calm, but they changed everything. Ethan did not argue. He did not ask for another chance. He simply looked at Alexander with a quiet sadness that was harder to bear than anger. Because Ethan understood something in that moment. Love could not survive if only one person was willing to fight for it. "I understand," Ethan whispered. Alexander expected disappointment. He expected tears. He expected Ethan to try to convince him. Instead, Ethan accepted the answer with a dignity that made Alexander uncomfortable. "I hope you find the future you believe you need," Ethan said. Those words stayed in Alexander's mind long after the hall became empty. That night, Ethan returned to the room he once considered his home. He looked at the memories they created together, the books they shared, and the quiet moments when he believed they were building a future. But he also understood that staying meant waiting for someone who had already chosen not to choose him. Before sunrise, Ethan packed his belongings. He left without anger, without revenge, and without asking anyone to stop him. When the palace awakened, Alexander still believed everything would return to normal. He believed Ethan would eventually come back. He believed time would solve what had happened. But when he opened the door to Ethan's room and saw the empty space inside, he felt something he had never expected. For the first time, the future king realized that some people were not lost because they stopped caring. Some people left because they finally learned they deserved to be chosen. The first night without Ethan Brooks was the first night Prince Alexander Whitmore realized that silence could feel heavier than any responsibility placed on his shoulders. The palace remained exactly the same. The royal guards stood in their usual places. The grand halls continued to shine beneath golden lights. The advisors continued discussing matters of the kingdom. Yet something important had disappeared, and Alexander could not understand why the emptiness felt so impossible to ignore. At first, he convinced himself that Ethan would return. Alexander believed that after some time apart, Ethan would understand his decision. He believed that the connection they shared could survive one painful conversation. After all, Alexander was the future king. He'd spent his entire life learning that personal desires had to come second to duty. That belief had guided every choice he made. But each morning that passed without Ethan made that certainty weaker. No one in the palace noticed the small changes. They did not notice how. Alexander paused whenever he walked past the library where Ethan used to spend quiet afternoons. They did not notice how he looked toward the entrance hall whenever footsteps approached, expecting someone who never arrived. They did not notice because everyone saw the prince. They saw the future king, the symbol of strength and responsibility. They never saw the person who missed the one individual who treated him like a normal man. Ethan had never asked Alexander for wealth or status. He never wanted the attention that came with the royal family. He only wanted honesty. He wanted to know that the person he loved would choose him even when choosing him was difficult. Alexander remembered every moment when Ethan had been there for him. During stressful days filled with royal meetings, Ethan was the person who reminded him to rest. During moments of doubt, Ethan was the person who reminded him that he was more than a title. But Alexander had convinced himself that those moments were weaknesses. He believed a future ruler could not allow personal feelings to influence important decisions. Now, standing alone in the palace, he began questioning whether he had misunderstood what strength truly meant. One evening, Alexander entered the library and found a book Ethan had left behind. It was a simple thing, something most people would have ignored. But inside the cover was a small note Ethan had written months earlier. It was not a goodbye message. It was a reminder of a conversation they planned to continue. Alexander read the words several times, realizing Ethan had not left because he stopped caring. Ethan had left because he finally accepted that staying meant waiting for someone who would not choose him. That realization stayed with Alexander. He had thought rejecting Ethan would protect his future. Instead, it had created a future that felt strangely incomplete. The palace had everything a prince could need, but it no longer felt warm. For the first time, Alexander wondered if the greatest mistake of his life was not choosing the crown over love. Maybe it was believing he had to lose one to keep the other. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, Ethan Brooks was, beginning a new life where he no longer waited for someone else to decide his worth. 6 months had passed since Ethan Brooks left Whitmore Palace, and during that time, he discovered something he had forgotten about himself. He discovered that his life was not defined by whether a prince chose him. For years, Ethan had believed that love meant patience. He believed that if he stayed by Alexander Whitmore's side long enough, the walls around the future king's heart would eventually disappear. He believed that one day Alexander would look beyond the crown and see the person who had always been there. But leaving the palace taught Ethan a different lesson. Love should never require someone to constantly prove they are worthy of being chosen. In the peaceful town of Rosewood, Ethan created a life that belonged completely to him. Away from royal expectations and endless whispers, he opened a small creative studio where he designed elegant clothing and restored old books. The place was simple but meaningful. Every corner carried a piece of the person he had become. The shelves were filled with stories that inspired him. The windows allowed warm sunlight to fill the room each morning. The quiet atmosphere reminded him that he had finally built a home that did not depend on anyone else's approval. People in Rosewood knew Ethan as a talented creator with a kind heart. They did not know him as the Omega who was rejected by a prince. They did not define him by the moment that broke his confidence. They saw his talent, his kindness, and his determination. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was truly living instead of waiting. Meanwhile, Alexander continued his duties at Whitmore Palace. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. The future king remained respected by the kingdom. His decisions were praised by advisors. His image remained exactly what everyone expected. But inside, Alexander was slowly realizing that success felt different when there was no one to share it with. He began noticing small things he had once ignored. The empty chair in the library, the quiet evenings without conversations, the absence of someone who used to remind him that he did not have to carry every burden alone. Alexander started asking questions he had avoided for too long. Had he protected the future, or had he simply been afraid? Had he chosen responsibility, or had he used responsibility as an excuse to avoid vulnerability? The answers were becoming harder to ignore. One afternoon, Alexander attended a cultural event outside the capital. He expected another formal gathering filled with polite conversations. Instead, he saw something that completely changed the way he viewed the past. Among the featured creators was Ethan. Standing in front of his designs, Ethan looked confident, peaceful, and completely different from the person who once stood in the royal hall waiting for Alexander's answer. Alexander watched from a distance and realized something painful. Ethan had not spent the last 6 months waiting for him to change. Ethan had moved forward. When their eyes finally met, the world around them seemed to become quiet. Ethan did not look angry. He did not look like someone seeking revenge. He simply looked like someone who had found himself. Alexander approached carefully. "It has been a long time," he said. Ethan gave a gentle nod. "Yes, it has." Those simple words carried the weight of everything they had lost. Alexander wanted to explain. He wanted to tell Ethan that he had never stopped thinking about him. But standing there, seeing the peaceful life Ethan had built, he understood something important. Ethan did not need the prince who once rejected him. He had already become someone strong enough to stand on his own. And for the first time, Alexander feared that the person he thought would always wait for him had finally learned how to live without him. The meeting between Alexander Whitmore and Ethan Brooks ended after only a few minutes. But those few minutes changed something inside the prince that years of royal training could not. For the first time, Alexander saw the truth without the protection of his title. Ethan was not waiting for him to return. He was not standing in the same place where Alexander had left him. Ethan had built a life beyond Whitmore Palace, and that life was peaceful because it belonged entirely to him. On the journey back to the capital, Alexander sat quietly, thinking about every moment he had misunderstood. He remembered how Ethan used to smile during simple conversations, how he always noticed when Alexander carried too much pressure, and how he never treated him like a future king. Ethan had been the one person who saw Alexander without the crown. Yet Alexander had been so focused on protecting his image that he failed to protect the person who mattered most. When Alexander returned to the palace, he walked through the same halls that once felt familiar. But now they felt different. The paintings, the grand rooms, and the endless royal traditions reminded him of everything he had chosen over Ethan. He had believed that becoming a great ruler meant sacrificing personal happiness. But Ethan's absence showed him another truth. A person could have everything the world admired and still feel like something important was missing. Days passed, and Alexander found himself thinking about Ethan more often. Not because Ethan had changed, but because Alexander finally understood what Ethan had always given him. Ethan had offered comfort without asking for anything in return. He had offered honesty in a world where everyone carefully chose their words around the future king. He had offered a place where Alexander could stop pretending to be perfect. Meanwhile, Ethan continued building his future in Rosewood. He did not close his heart completely, but he no longer allowed the past to control him. He focused on his work, his friendships, and the community that welcomed him. The life he created was proof that leaving the palace had not destroyed him. It had helped him discover himself. One evening, Alexander received an invitation to a royal cultural celebration. The event would bring together creators and leaders from across the kingdom. As he read the list of guests, one name immediately caught his attention: Ethan Brooks. Alexander knew he would see Ethan again. Part of him was nervous because he understood something important. This meeting would not be like before. He could not simply walk toward Ethan as a prince expecting to be forgiven. He could not assume that a title or apology would repair years of hurt. If he wanted any chance of rebuilding what was lost, he needed to approach Ethan as the person he had failed to understand. At the celebration, Alexander watched Ethan speak with confidence among artists and guests. Ethan was respected because of his own achievements, not because of any connection to the royal family. That realization stayed with Alexander. The person he once believed needed him had become someone who stood proudly without him. When their eyes met again, Alexander felt the weight of every word he had never said. "Ethan," he finally spoke. Ethan looked at him calmly. "Prince Alexander." The title sounded different now. Once it represented closeness. Now, it represented the distance between them. Alexander took a quiet breath and understood that this time he would have to earn the chance to be seen differently. Because losing Ethan had taught him the hardest lesson of all. Love was never something guaranteed by destiny. It was something protected through choice, respect, and understanding. The days after Alexander Whitmore and Ethan Brooks met again were filled with quiet changes that neither of them expected. Alexander returned to Whitmore Palace carrying a different feeling than before. In the past, he had always believed that time would solve difficult situations. He believed distance would make painful choices easier to accept. But after seeing Ethan again, he understood that time had not erased the consequences of his decision. It had only shown him how much Ethan had grown without him. Alexander knew that a simple apology would not be enough. He could not walk back into Ethan's life and expect everything to return to the way it was before. The person Ethan had become deserved more than words. He deserved honesty, patience, and respect. For the first time, Alexander decided not to act as a prince trying to control the outcome. He decided to act as a man willing to accept whatever answer Ethan gave him. When Alexander returned to Rosewood, he did not arrive with royal guards or a formal announcement. He came quietly, hoping to speak with Ethan without the weight of the crown. Between them, Ethan welcomed him into the studio, but there was a noticeable difference between them. Years ago, Ethan would have immediately searched Alexander's expression for signs of affection. Now, he simply observed him calmly, understanding that his own happiness no longer depended on what Alexander felt. They spent hours talking about the years they had missed. Alexander learned about the challenges Ethan faced while building his new life. He learned about the moments when Ethan felt uncertain, the moments when he had to choose himself, and the moments when he realized leaving the palace had saved more than his heart. Ethan listened as Alexander explained the fears that had influenced his decision. He heard about the expectations of the royal family and the pressure placed on a future ruler. But Ethan also understood something important. A difficult situation could explain a choice, but it could not erase the pain caused by that choice. "I understand why you were afraid," Ethan said softly. "But I needed to know that I mattered more than your fear." Alexander looked down because he knew Ethan was right. That was the truth he had avoided for years. He had spent so much time protecting a future that he forgot to protect the person standing beside him. "You were never the problem," Alexander said. "I was afraid of losing everything. I did not realize I was already losing the most important thing." Ethan remained quiet. The words touched him, but he knew healing required more than a meaningful conversation. Trust was something rebuilt through actions. Alexander understood that. He did not ask Ethan to forgive him immediately. He did not ask him to return to the palace. Instead, he asked for the chance to prove that he had changed. Over the following weeks, Alexander continued visiting Rosewood. He supported Ethan's work, listened to his thoughts, and respected the life Ethan created. He did not try to replace the past. He tried to create something new. Slowly, Ethan began noticing the difference. The prince who once made decisions alone was learning how to include someone else. The man who once feared losing control was learning that love was not about control at all. One evening, as they watched the sunset outside Ethan's studio, Alexander finally said the words he had struggled to express. "I cannot promise that I will never make mistakes again, but I can promise that I will never stop choosing to understand you." Ethan looked at him quietly, realizing that the person standing before him was not the same man who had rejected him years ago. The journey was not finished, but for the first time, they were no longer trying to return to the past. They were building a future where both of them could be seen, heard, and chosen. The changes between Alexander Whitmore and Ethan Brooks did not happen overnight. There was no single moment that erased the years they spent apart. Instead, their connection slowly transformed through small choices, honest conversations, and the understanding that trust was something built one step at a time. Alexander returned to Rosewood whenever his royal responsibilities allowed, not as a prince expecting a place in Ethan's life, but as someone grateful for every opportunity to know him again. He learned about Ethan's daily routines, the people who supported him, and the dreams he created after leaving Whitmore Palace. For the first time, Alexander saw the full picture of the life Ethan built without him. It was a life filled with purpose, kindness, and confidence. Ethan was no longer the person who stood in the royal hall hoping to be chosen. He was someone who had chosen himself. At Whitmore Palace, Alexander also began changing the way he approached his future as king. The royal council noticed that he no longer made decisions based only on tradition. He listened carefully to different opinions and considered the feelings of those affected by his choices. Some advisors questioned these changes, believing a ruler should always appear distant and unshaken. But Alexander understood something he never understood before. A leader who refuses to listen can never truly understand the people they serve. His transformation was not only about Ethan. It was about becoming the person he always wanted to be, but never knew how to become. One afternoon, Alexander invited Ethan to walk through the royal gardens. The place held many memories, including the moments before everything changed between them. Ethan looked around quietly, remembering the person he used to be. "I spent so much time wondering if I should have stayed," Ethan admitted. Alexander listened carefully. "And what do you think now?" Ethan smiled softly. "I think leaving helped me understand that I could have a life beyond waiting for someone to choose me." Alexander felt those words deeply, because he knew Ethan was right. The hardest lesson he learned was that love was not about convincing someone to stay. Love was about creating a place where someone wanted to stay freely. "I am sorry that I made you feel like you had to leave to find your worth," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. "I know you regret it." He paused before continuing. "But what matters is what you do with that regret." Alexander nodded because he understood. Regret alone could not repair anything. Only change could. As the months passed, the kingdom prepared for Alexander's official rise as ruler. Many people expected him to focus only on royal traditions and political expectations. But Alexander carried a different vision. He wanted to create a kingdom where people did not have to hide who they were to be respected. Ethan watched this change with careful attention. He saw that Alexander was not simply trying to win him back. He was becoming someone better even when nobody was watching. One evening, Ethan asked him a question that had remained unanswered for years. If you could return to that night, would you make the same choice? Alexander became quiet. He thought about the crown, the expectations, and the fear that once controlled him. Then he looked at Ethan. "No," he answered honestly, "because now I understand that losing you was not the sacrifice I needed to make. It was a mistake I needed to learn from." For the first time, Ethan saw no hesitation in Alexander's eyes. There was no pride, no fear, and no distance. Only honesty. And that was the moment Ethan realized the person standing before him was finally the person he had always hoped Alexander could become. The days leading up to Alexander Whitmore's coronation became a period of reflection for everyone in the kingdom, but especially for the future king himself. Years ago, Alexander believed that becoming a ruler meant putting aside every personal desire. He believed emotions created weakness and that a true leader had to remain distant. But after losing Ethan Brooks, he discovered that understanding others was not a weakness. It was the foundation of true leadership. As the kingdom prepared for the ceremony, Alexander faced a decision that carried more meaning than any royal tradition. He needed to decide what kind of king he wanted to become. The old Alexander would have focused only on appearances, expectations, and the opinions of those around him. The new Alexander wanted to build a future based on honesty and respect. Ethan watched these changes carefully. He knew that promises were easy to make, especially after someone realized what they had lost. What mattered was whether those promises continued when life became difficult. Ethan had learned to protect his own heart, and he would not return to the past simply because Alexander finally understood his mistake. He needed to see that the change was real. One evening before the coronation, Alexander asked Ethan to meet him in the royal garden, the same garden where they once talked about dreams they thought they would share together. The atmosphere was peaceful, but both of them understood the importance of the conversation ahead. "There was a time when I thought I lost you because of fate," Alexander said. "But I understand now that I lost you because of my own choice." Ethan looked at him quietly, allowing him to continue. "I thought choosing duty meant rejecting everything that could distract me from becoming king. I was wrong. A crown should not make someone forget the people who give their life meaning." Ethan felt the sincerity behind those words, but he remained careful. "Alexander, I believe you have changed, but I need you to understand something. I cannot become the person who simply waits for you again." Alexander nodded. "I do not want you to." His answer surprised Ethan. I do not want you beside me because you feel responsible for my happiness. I want you beside me because you have your own happiness and you still choose to share it with me." Those words showed Ethan the greatest difference between the man before him and the man standing there now. The old Alexander wanted certainty. He wanted to know that Ethan would always be there. The new Alexander understood that love could not be demanded. It had to be freely given. On the day of the coronation, the entire kingdom gathered to witness Alexander become king. The ceremony was filled with tradition, but Alexander's speech focused on something different. He spoke about learning from mistakes, listening to others, and creating a future where people did not have to hide their true selves to be accepted. Ethan stood among the guests, watching the man he once loved become someone new. Not perfect, not without flaws, but someone who had finally learned. After the ceremony, Alexander found Ethan in the palace gardens. "I know I cannot change what happened," Alexander said, "but I hope I can spend the future showing you that I am no longer the person who let you walk away." Ethan looked at him and smiled gently. "Then do not prove it with words. Prove it with every choice you make." Alexander smiled because he understood. Their story was no longer about a prince trying to reclaim something he lost. It was about two people choosing whether they wanted to build something new. And for the first time, Alexander was not afraid of the answer. After Alexander Whitmore became king, the kingdom entered a new era, but the greatest transformation happened quietly between two people who had once been separated by pride and fear. Alexander continued to prove that his changes were not temporary. Every decision he made reflected the lessons he had learned. He listened before speaking. He considered the feelings of others before making choices. Most importantly, he no longer believed that being a strong ruler meant hiding every emotion. Ethan Brooks watched these changes from a distance at first. He had spent years learning how to stand on his own, and he refused to forget the person he had become. He did not want to return to the palace as someone who needed Alexander's approval. He wanted to return only if they could stand together as equals. Over time, Ethan saw that Alexander's growth was real. The king who once believed he had to carry every responsibility alone was learning that trust was not a burden. It was a strength. Their relationship slowly became something different from what it had been before. They did not try to recreate the past because both of them had changed too much. Instead, they built something new based on honesty and understanding. Alexander began asking Ethan about his thoughts on royal matters, not because he wanted to make a perfect impression, but because he truly valued his perspective. Ethan brought a different view to the palace, one that reminded Alexander that a kingdom was not just made of traditions and laws. It was made of people. One afternoon, Ethan returned to the royal library, a place that once carried painful memories. Years earlier, he had spent countless hours there dreaming about a future with Alexander. Now, he stood among the same shelves as someone completely different. Alexander joined him and noticed the quiet smile on Ethan's face. "You remember this place?" Alexander said. Ethan nodded. "I remember who I was here." Alexander looked at him carefully. "And who are you now?" Ethan smiled softly. "Someone who knows he does not need to be chosen to have value." The answer stayed with Alexander because it represented the lesson he had struggled to learn. He had once believed Ethan's love was something guaranteed. He believed Ethan would always wait because their connection felt special. But love was never a promise that removed choice. Love became stronger when two people chose each other freely every day. As months passed, the people of Whitmore Kingdom began to admire Ethan not because of his connection to the king, but because of who he was. His creativity, kindness, and dedication inspired many people. He created programs to support young artists and help bring new ideas into the kingdom. Alexander watched proudly because he understood something important. Ethan did not complete his life. Ethan shared a life that was already complete. One evening, they stood together on a balcony overlooking the kingdom. The lights below reflected the peaceful future they had created. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had never left?" Ethan asked. Alexander thought for a moment. "I do, but I also know we would not be the people we are today." Ethan smiled. "Maybe we both needed to lose something before we understood what mattered." Alexander looked at him and gently nodded. Years ago, he had feared that choosing Ethan would take something away from him. Now he knew the truth. Choosing Ethan had never been a sacrifice. It was the decision that helped him find himself. And as the kingdom moved forward, their story became a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about finding someone perfect. They are about two people who learn, grow, and choose each other again. Years had passed since Alexander Whitmore and Ethan Brooks found their way back to each other, and the kingdom often spoke about the changes that came with the new king's reign. People noticed the improvements throughout Whitmore Kingdom, the thoughtful decisions, and the way Alexander treated every person with patience and respect. But those who knew the king personally understood that the greatest change was not found in royal halls or official decisions. It was found in the quiet moments when Alexander no longer felt the need to hide who he truly was. Long ago, Alexander believed that being a ruler meant sacrificing everything personal. He believed emotions were distractions, and that choosing duty over love was the only way to become a worthy king. But losing Ethan taught him a lesson he could never have learned from books, advisors, or royal traditions. A crown could give someone authority, but could not give someone happiness. Ethan had once stood beside him without caring about his title. He had seen the doubts, the fears, and the person behind the royal image. Losing that connection forced Alexander to understand what truly mattered. Ethan also changed during those years. The person who once waited for Alexander's choice became someone who understood his own worth. He no longer needed a royal title to feel important. He no longer needed someone else's approval to believe he deserved love and respect. When he returned to Alexander's life, it was not because he needed a place beside a king. It was because he wanted to share his future with someone who had finally learned how to value him. One evening, Alexander and Ethan stood together in the gardens of Whitmore Palace, the same place where they had once dreamed about a future that never happened. But this time, there was no uncertainty between them. There was no fear of being rejected or misunderstood. There was only the quiet comfort of two people who had grown through their experiences. "Do you think we would have found our way here if everything had been different?" Ethan asked. Alexander looked at the garden and thought about the years they spent apart. "Maybe not," he answered honestly. "The person I was back then was not ready to understand what I had." Ethan smiled softly. "And the person I was back then did not know he deserved more." Alexander looked at him with gratitude. "I am thankful you chose yourself when I failed to choose you." Those words meant more than any promise because they showed how much both of them had changed. Their story was never about one person saving another. It was about two people learning, healing, and becoming stronger before choosing each other again. The kingdom would remember Alexander as a great king, but Ethan would always remember the man behind the crown, the man who learned from his mistakes. The man who discovered that love was not something to control or fear. The man who finally understood that the greatest treasure in his life was never the throne waiting for him. It was the person who had always seen him as more than a king. And together, Alexander and Ethan created a future built not on obligation, but on trust, respect, and a choice they made every single day.